Okay, so 2024. The world is a beautiful place, stable. AI is a delightful teammate. Work is abundant. Billionaires are using their collective wealth to resolve the world's toughest challenges. The future is bright, right? Yeah, well, maybe not. Welcome to the permacrisis, folks. I'm Ceri. I'm a behavioral coach, often referred to as an agile behavioral coach. My background is in teaching, psychology. I'm partway through a neuroscience master's, which means I know just how much I don't know. And my work is, generally speaking, helping technical teams and leaders to cope with and to deliver in the face of rapid and unexpected change. And I'm a nerd, so there's a QR code that has references to various studies that I have taken what I'm going to say to you from. So if any of you are nerds and like the rigor and the studies to back things up, those are there. There's also a reading list that I'll come to at the end as well. All for you, my loves. Okay, so today I am going to be talking about stress, about burnout, how stress leads to burnout, and how both of those things often make the conflict that we experience in our teams from time to time so much worse. And I'm going to begin by looking at where these things come from. We're going to move into looking at how stress might make things harder to deal with and the impact that that might have on us, on our teams, on our organizations. And then finally, we're going to have a look at what we might be able to do about any of it. Maybe. But to begin with, I invite you to close your eyes and picture yourself in a dark, quiet forest. And as you're stood there, alone, behind you a twig snaps. A moment later, your friends come through the trees and they've found you. They've been looking for you for hours and everything's okay. Okay, you can open your eyes. Okay, at the moment that the twig snapped, how did you feel? How many of you had a reaction to the twig? Yeah, sorry about that. So we have an estimated 80 billion neurons. There's around 300,000 connections on each neuron. And that means that we think that we experience rational thought. However, even if the threat isn't real, even if it's imagined, we react as if it's really happening. Our brains, as Portia said earlier, brains can't tell the difference between imagined and real. And this is shown up in MRI scans where people's visualizations triggered activity in the same areas of their brains that would be activated if they were experiencing the thing in real life, in their visual and motor cortex, for those of you who are interested. So maybe when that twig snapped, you would have noticed your heart rate pick up. Maybe you felt a bit more tense. And for those of you who maybe are more imaginative or slightly more anxious, you might have had a more pronounced reaction or response. Now, these have come from a long history. These are responses that have developed over time. We've evolved, essentially, to stay alive. And those of us who have a better response to these things, we're more likely to survive. We're more likely to pass on these responses. And so what we end up with now are inherited traits. It's the same brain structure, regardless of myths you might hear about reptilian brains. It's the same brain structure. And these responses are primal, not primitive, and certainly not reptilian. And there's a really great model, actually, that I like to share that you can use to help you understand your brain. This comes from Dr. Dan Siegel. It's called the brain in the hand model, and you can do it yourself. You just take your hand, you cross your thumb across your palm, and you close your fingers down over the top. Super easy. Now, your fingers here, this is your cortex, and the two in the middle here, that represents your prefrontal cortex. That's the bit at the front of your brain here. Your brain stem is down here. That's the bit that is largely connected or related to heart rate, to breathing, all of your autonomic bodily functions. Your cortex is theoretically responsible for our rational thought, our problem solving, our creativity, and so on. Now, your palm under here, that's responsible for your, or connected with your emotions. So your motivation, your fight or flight response when it's triggered by hormones. Now, this is you in a rational state. This is you when you're calm. But Dan Siegel calls this flipping your lid. This is you when you are triggered for whatever reason. This is a metaphor. It's not literal. It's not actually happening in your brain. But so it represents essentially a loss of blood flow to the centres of our brain that are responsible for our rational thought, our creativity. You've got your amygdala here on your thumb knuckle. This is the bit that kicks off your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So whenever you feel under threat, whenever you feel anger or anxiety, that's the bit that's triggering those. And your brain does this, your amygdala specifically does this, using the significance of events using emotional memory. So things that you've experienced in the past that have some sort of emotional significance. Any previous experiences with emotions attached to them, those will be what's triggering that response. And what's interesting is that those responses can be inherited, so they can be passed on down the generations. That's called epigenetics. So your brain predicts what's happening, predicts what's going to happen next, and then it generates what are appropriate responses in order for you to survive. And it does this based on context, but essentially these are just guesses. The important thing to note here is that all of this is bypassing your cortex. All of this is happening without rational thought, without problem solving, without logic, and it's going on without us often being aware. Okay, so we're kicking off our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response, which we're going to talk about using jelly sweets. And this happens incidentally both when we're experiencing eustress, so that's good stress, excitement, positive challenges, but also distress, bad stress, negativity, unpleasant sensations. Okay, so we get a flood of neurochemicals. We get adrenaline, which is the urge to move. We need to escape the threat. We also experience a flood of cortisol. This has the effect of suppressing. So it suppresses our immune system, it suppresses our digestion, it suppresses our libido, and also our cells' ability to grow or repair. Interestingly, when that then gets overblown, so sustained exposure to cortisol actually leads to something called hypercortisolism, which is where then those responses essentially get burned out. So instead of suppressing, you get a hyper response instead. So this leads to things like allergies, overeating, sex addiction, and mutating cells. So there's an increase in cancer rates as a result of the stress experienced from the pandemic and the isolation and all of the everything that went along with that. Okay. Next, acetylcholine. This gives us a sense of urgency. So either a rush to get a train or a plane that maybe then gets cancelled, or if you're someone who has to somehow work out how to manage 6 hours of back-to-back face-to-face meetings that are no longer on Zoom, that's that sensation there. And then the fourth one is norepinephrine. This gives us that sense of alertness. So when you experience the twig snapping, I gave you a little rush of norepinephrine. Sorry. You also get it if an alarm goes off, or if you're maybe working and your kids are in the other room, or your pets, and there's a smash, and then there's silence. That's norepinephrine. Okay, so these are involuntary neurobiological responses. We don't control them. They are evolved to keep us alive and keep us safe. In no way can we stop these things happening. They are beyond conscious awareness. And your brain does this to save energy because conscious awareness is actually really expensive in terms of energy. And just to give you an idea of just how much of this goes on beyond your awareness, pick a circle, or maybe imagine a circle that's not on the page, that maybe represents your conscious self. So the amount of your brain that is currently aware that you're in this room, listening to this talk and processing all of the things that I'm saying, versus all of those autonomic responses, fight and flight, and so on. Yeah, that's the circle. That's the proportion of your brain that is consciously aware, and everything else that's going on in your brain. And this is what people talk about when they're talking about that 5% or 10% capacity. Your whole brain is being used. It's just you're only consciously aware of a tiny amount of it. So what we're saying here is stress means that our responses bypass our cortex and our behavior is reflexive, not intentional. And this is not just a case of stimulus and response. We actually have an intervening variable that impacts our response. So that could look like being tired or being hungry, if you're emotional, feeling emotional at your gas bill, or if you're being the subject of quiet firing, being made to come into the office 5 days a week, because that's how you get people to buy into your company ideals. So this is a reciprocal physiological response. That means your state affects your response, which affects your state, which affects your response. You could maybe say that stress is a bit nuts. And so stress then happens largely when we see that our situation is novel, is new, something not previously experienced. Maybe there's an uncertain outcome. Maybe we think that that outcome might be harmful, or it might challenge our well-being, or maybe it's something that we can't overcome. So maybe we feel hopeless. And it's linked to feeling that we have limited or no power to change the outcome. And it's chemical and interpretative. So our amygdala is responding, it's deciding how we respond. And it can be linked to experiences like having an appraisal, or maybe a particularly challenging retrospective, or having to give or receive feedback, or maybe deliver a conference talk on a stage, or being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or, maybe zombies. Okay. Similarly, anxiety is another intervening variable. This is where we have acute awareness of the risk. Now, this response is great for short-term or simple tasks, carrying, lifting, running, escaping, those sorts of things. It's not so great for the complex things that we do day to day. And that's because the brain diverts energy away from the cortex and moves it towards our physical needs. And that means there's less oxygen in your prefrontal cortex. That means that we are trying to think our way through a brick wall when we are in these stressful situations in a work environment trying to solve these problems. It's not going to work. So it can trigger blind panic, visualizing it going wrong, and then because we visualize and we experience that as real, it feels like it's real. We become hyper-aware. This triggers norepinephrine. This is the alertness neurochemical. We experience overwhelm. This is not fight or flight. This is something we can't overcome, so we freeze. There's no control, and so there's no point. Now, we've evolved these responses to help us deal with short-term challenges, to escape danger, to evade. But actually, we're experiencing these things for days, weeks, months. And that was the case even before the pandemic, even before questions about hybrid working and all the rest. So what this then leads to then is burnout. And this is where the emotional effort takes such a toll that we can no longer continue with what we wanted to do cognitively. So we are physically and mentally exhausted. We have less enjoyment. We're less motivated to do things. It's hard to care. And this is where burnout is essentially where the reward no longer offsets the effort. Now, there are some worrying implications. So this actually leads to scarring and aging in your brain, and specifically on the areas of your brain that regulate and process emotions. So that means that if you're suffering from more burnout, you're more prone to startle, you're more prone to, you have less emotional regulation. It also means that you have less creativity, less problem solving. You suffer from lack of attention, your memory might also struggle, and you essentially have a burned out stress response system. We're not going to be getting the best from the people around us if they are in this state. They're not going to be getting the best from you if you are in this state. Okay, quick experiment. How is her mood? Now, you don't have to answer. Just consider this for yourselves. But maybe you think she looks a bit grumpy, a bit cross, a bit sad. Maybe she's completely neutral. Maybe you think she's smirking. Maybe she's judging you. She probably is. Now, we interpret our safety, our levels of connection with the people around us using vocal tone, facial expressions, and body language. Actually, one of the most significant of these is vocal tone, despite what anybody will tell you about facial expression. But we use these things to tell us how safe we are. What's interesting here is that the more stressed we are, the more stressed we are, the more negatively we will interpret even neutral facial expressions. So if someone is looking at you neutrally and you are more burned out, you're more likely to interpret that as an aggressive facial expression. Similarly with tone of voice or in an email, if you're more burned out, you're more likely to interpret that negatively. So this is something then that we can use in our teams. Right? So how burned out are you, and helping us to be more aware of how burned out we are maybe looking at neutral faces and each assessing how negatively we are seeing those faces. It could be a good indicator. She's actually meta-human. She's AI, but we still interpret what we see. And this is really important when we're maybe in a hybrid work setting, if we're experiencing online calls where we have even less context. And what this tends to lead to is a significant amount of drama. Now, even before the pandemic and the permacrisis, it was estimated that we spend around 2.5 hours of every day involved in some kind of workplace drama, blaming, judging, politics, people with ego, arguing about accountability, frustration, anger. It's exhausting. Now, we might like to think that we are good people, as long as we're not sat within the dark triad. So that means, essentially, if I am a good person, I am validated, I'm accepted. Now, our ancient ancestors were more likely to survive in social groups, so the more socialized among us were the ones that tended to survive. Being a good X, Y, Z means that I'm more likely to stay safe, means I'm more likely to stay alive. And what this means is that when it comes to negativity from our teammates, we take even the tiniest signs of rejection very seriously. And again, just to draw you back to this idea that the brain experiences imagined things as physical things, experiencing social rejection manifests as physical pain, literally like being punched in the face. So they're going to kick me off in a minute. So what this leads to is increases in drama and what's known as othering. So us versus them. And the more burnout you experience, the more drama that creates and the more likely you are to experience that us versus them. We experience this, the more we sense that resources are scarce. So this means we create in-groups and out-groups. Any safe consultants here feeling loved and welcomed and included? Right, resources are scarce, and so in-groups and out-groups. It means that we show less compassion. Safe consultants are people too. So are leaders. What it means is that we find it much easier to dehumanize. We show more contempt, we tut, we roll our eyes. So more drama, more othering, more burnout, more drama, more othering. And this means that when we experience things like feedback, even if it's over something very small, we tend to take it more as a criticism of ourselves, not a criticism of the idea. This criticism means I'm not a good person. And we respond with denial or indignation or finger pointing or blame. And then both people in that conversation feel more stressed, more unsafe. And interestingly, with criticism, I see my mistakes as related to circumstances, whereas your mistakes are an inherent character flaw. That means I make mistakes because of what happened to me, whereas you make mistakes because of who you are. And these are subconscious snap judgments. We all do this. Now, let's have a quick recap. So we've looked at the brain in the hand, how we don't access rational thought when we flip our lid. We've looked at how the body has involuntary chemical responses to stress, and that changes our behavior. We've looked at stress, anxiety, overwhelm. We've looked at burnout, how we reach those states, how they can affect our ability to regulate our emotions. We've looked at how we interpret facial expression more negatively under stress. And we've looked at framing us versus them, contempt, dehumanizing, and how that allows us to treat others as culpable. Okay, what can we take from all of this? State, effects, perspective, and response. But we remain neuroplastic until we're dead, or undead if you prefer. Our brains are shaped by each and every experience and interaction. Even this talk will be reshaping your brain as I give it. And this means that there's hope. We can do better. A really great first step is to begin with noticing your physical state. What are the physical signs that maybe I'm feeling stressed? Has my heart rate gone up? Is my throat tight? Am I speaking faster? Am I speaking louder, more aggressively? How am I feeling? Am I calm? Is this pleasant or not right now? As we become more aware, it gives us the tools to be able to regulate more. We can choose, we can reframe the story. So the visualization manifests as real. So if we picture it slightly differently, we will experience it as slightly differently. And then we can respond to the rush of neurochemicals. So adrenaline, This provokes us to move, so we can move, run, jump, wave your arms, jog on the spot. We're giving our body cues to show that we are responding to the threat. And genuinely, this works. Cortisol, this is the suppression of various systems. Now, cortisol, there's an initial flood that takes about 90 seconds to subside. Cortisol is not actually bad, by the way. It's the thing that wakes you up naturally in the morning if you wake up before your alarm clock. But it's changed by our experience of the situation. So how I interpret the situation changes my experience of it. So if we can ride that out and reframe whilst we're sitting that 90 seconds out, then we're going to have a better time and have better onward responses. Noticing that I'm okay. And this is called behavioral extinction. There are references on the site. I won't go into detail now. There's a very simple breathing exercise that you can do. People talk a lot about breathing exercises, and that's because there's some science that backs it up. It's not woolly, fluffy stuff. My favorite one is one that replicates laughing, crying, and singing. These are all self-soothing breathing responses. So that's 2 sharp breaths in and a long breath out. None of that breathing square stuff, that actually just maintains the same state. So if you're stressed, when you go into that breathing square, you're going to carry on at the same state. In, out. You can try this before you go and give someone feedback, or before you step on stage, or before you have a disagreement with someone, or before you challenge a senior leader in a meeting in front of everybody. All sorts of opportunities. Okay, that sense of urgency or panic. Do something. You might not be able to solve the whole problem, but maybe you can identify the next 3 steps. Or, as Carl spoke about recently, you can just do the next right thing. Thank you, Anna from Frozen. Norepinephrine, giving us a sense of alertness. You can ground yourself in reality. There is a great tool using the 5 senses to ground yourself. So that's going through, in this moment, what are 5 things that I can see, 4 things that I can hear, 3 things that I can feel, 2 things that I can smell, and 1 thing that I can taste. I've been told I should have put that on a slide, but I didn't, so you'll just have to remember it. Okay. When I'm feeling a bit calmer, I can then start to reassess the situation. Okay, what do I know for sure? What am I assuming? What am I assuming about the other person's intent or about the implications for me? What am I visualizing as the likely outcome from this? What's the story that I'm letting myself believe, and how can I reframe that? In the longer term, we can practice things like acceptance. So practical pessimism, I like to call it. Noticing and accepting, stopping fighting our reality, stopping trying to be in an ideal world and instead being where we are. We can't control the uncontrollable. Instead, though, we can decide what we do next. We can use phrases like, although this is a steaming pile, here are some things we can do to make it slightly better. Given that this is a steaming pile, this is what I'm going to do. We can also practice realistic optimism. That's where we retain hope, but we plan for obstacles. I mean, isn't that the point of a daily check-in or a daily stand-up if you want to be ableist? We can use what's real instead of the fantasy, instead of the ideal. So we live in an unstable world. We want stability, but disruption and change are normal. And we never know what's going to happen to us next. What we have is a biopsychosocial problem. That is, we've got physical response to environmental triggers, and then we reactively interpret those circumstances. And all of this is affected also by how connected we feel. Now, recent studies have shown that relationships stimulate learning and growth. So we can support this. We can move from self-regulation to co-regulation. How do we move to co-regulation? Simple. We use cues. Ages I took on that one. Cues. So, you're safe. I've got your back, you've got mine. Showing people that you care because they have value. When I give you this feedback, I'm not doing this so that I can get one up over you. I'm doing it because I care about how you're doing and your future and your well-being, and I think you can do better than this. And believing that people care about you because you have value. We can also do things like showing genuine gratitude, genuine appreciation, not just lip service appreciation, not just saying thanks because you've been told to, but actually finding things that you're genuinely grateful for, no matter how small. we can pay it forward. We can be generous with our time, with our attention, with our effort, with our help. And instead of gossip, we can practice something called positive gossip, which is a pro-social behavior. That means instead of saying negative things behind someone's back, you go around and tell all of the people that you know about how brilliant Pavel was, about how superb and how impactful that talk was earlier from Portia. Don't tell Portia that. Tell all of the people around Portia that. And then word gets back to Portia. Everybody gets a good feeling from that. Portia gets a great time. You get the feeling of saying something nice, and so does the person that passes that message on. We can also use tacos. Celebrate tacos. That's tiny accomplishments and successes. I actually stole this, but I can't remember who from, so I can't reference it. But if it's you, sorry, I stole it. This is all of the small wins, kudos cards, silly awards ceremonies, maybe for things like Brave Conversation of the Week. Tacos. Okay, I want you to try something. Very briefly, I want you to turn to the person nearest to you, and it's an invitation. If you're not a talker, if you're an introvert, you can just sit silently and look at your phone for a minute. That's fine too. But turn to the person next to you, and I want you just to introduce yourself, just for a moment. Okay. Okay. Really brief. I'm not going to make you... I know, it's so short, wasn't it? Okay, so how many of you told your company name, your role, and your name? You all did that, right? Yeah, okay. So what you've used there is the military code of honor for captured prisoners of war. That's where you give your name, your rank, and your service number. Yeah, okay. Okay, close your eyes. Take a moment, notice your state. How are you feeling? What have you been thinking about recently? What are you worrying about? What's making your heart sing? Okay, open your eyes. Keep those thoughts in mind. Introduce yourselves again. Go again. Okay, welcome back. I imagine that was a completely different experience. Yeah, okay. When we share real information, not just superficial information, we stimulate our social needs. And so one of the questions that I love asking people is not what you do, but what's your passion? What are you delighted with at the moment? What's going well? Talking about things that sit underneath the surface can be just as great a way to introduce yourself to somebody, but without the superficial level of connection. So there was an interesting social experiment. There was an article in the New Yorker based on a study that was run. Again, links to the study are on that QR code, which I'll show again at the end. But they asked 36 questions of a group of volunteers. And the questions started off quite light-hearted, quite simple, with things like, who would you want as a dinner guest? And then they quite quickly moved progressively deeper. So when did you last cry in front of another person or by yourself? And then they went really deep. So if you were to die this evening, what would you most regret not having told someone, and why haven't you told them yet? Oof. Yeah. I have used this in a work context. If you do choose to run this, I highly recommend that you take out all of the questions about childhood, just for genuinely for the safety of the people that you're actually putting into these conversations. That can be potentially quite triggering, and I wouldn't do that to people without the necessary credentials behind you. But the rest of the questions are great, and I highly recommend using them as a tool to bring people more closer together in your team. Now, we do have to be careful, though, because in the original study, they actually ended up with 2 of the participants falling in love. So depending on your workplace policy, you might want to be careful about just how far through those questions you go. Okay, so other ways to foster support and connection. I use a tool that I call the worry wall. There is a counterpoint called the wall of awesome, which I don't have time to share today, but the worry wall, one of my favorite tools for fostering connection, especially in teams where there's less psychological safety. So this just sits on the wall. Often you have to pre-populate it. And essentially you can do this with your team. If those of you who have retrospectives, it's a great retrospective activity. So you get your team to write down everything that's worrying them from a work perspective, and then you put them into 3 of these columns. So the things that I can change, or the things that we can change. The things that I or we can change, but we're going to need some help to get there. And then finally, the things that I can't change. Now, what is fascinating about this is the conversation that it provokes, because I might put something in the can change column, you've written down the same thing and put it in the can't change column. As a visual radiator, it's also really useful for leadership to see the sorts of things that teams are struggling with. But the column that I like the most is the can change with help. You put your problems in there, and then it's up to other people, either in your team or in your organization. Obviously, you have to share a little bit about the tool, but other people can put their names on the sticky notes that people need help with. You don't have to directly go out and admit not knowing something or not being able to find something if it's not psychologically safe for you to admit those failings in your workplace. You can put the sticky up, it's completely anonymous, and then someone who can help can put their name on that sticky. You then have a choice about whether you go and pursue that person to get that support and that help that you need. It's a brilliant tool. It's got so many more uses. I don't have time to go into more detail today, but yeah, highly recommend it. And it creates a great starting point for conversations, and it also generates some quite good buy-in from leadership when they start to see the sorts of things that are putting up there, and yeah, helps them see things maybe as they really are. So it creates space for conversations without shame. We also can focus on, what we're trying to move towards here is focusing on growth. We're trying to be braver. We're trying to move towards a position where we're maybe being a little less suspicious of each other, and perhaps a little more suspicious of our own certainty about what we see, about what we think, about what we feel. Moving from self-regulation to co-regulation. And we have to do this. We need connection. We only get through these things that we are facing together. Going it alone won't always work. As the wonderful Dave Snowden said, every corpse on Everest was an extremely motivated person, and without a support system, the individual will fail. We need the people around us. Okay, so we've looked at brains. We've looked at our reactions. We've looked at some things that might help. We've seen that this is not a simple, one-sided issue. This is a biopsychosocial problem, and that needs a biopsychosocial response. Now, perhaps I've confirmed a lot of things that you already knew, and that's okay too. But common sense, things being obvious, the think-do gap doesn't necessarily lead to action. We need to have perspective of where we really are for that to happen. Things being simple doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy. We've got simple solutions. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's super easy to take the next step. Hard doesn't necessarily mean impossible. Thank you.